Hey, Michael.
What's up, Brandon? How
Hey,
are you?
buddy. Good, man.
Nice paradise.
I want to be here. That's the only reason I put it up. It's not for everyone else. It's just so I can remind myself one day I will get there.
Yes. Although today is a beautiful day.
Oh my God. Yesterday was so cold.
Yeah.
This morning, I'm like, okay, it's going to be cold. I got to do stuff in my backyard and stuff. Put on the sweater and pants. I'm like, oh my God, what's going on here?
It's colder inside my house than it is outside.
Yeah, totally. Totally. We got the AC pumping.
No, I'm just saying it's colder from this morning. Like I haven't even.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm out here in Sherman Oaks, so it's always a little bit warmer out here. But I was looking outside and I saw like these cute bunnies, like these big wild bunnies, just like literally right there, and they weren't even afraid. It was pretty cool.
Well, look, you and Jeff are in the same place.
Actually, I think it's kind of cutting off my hair a little bit.
Oh, there you go.
I might go none. There we go. Let's see how this works.
You see, only I know Jeffrey Kahn is probably in his guest bedroom from our broker calls.
That is correct.
I just posted in the chat box the handout for today. It will hopefully upload now. Alfredo, do you know if that handout will be visible to people that sign on after?
It should be, yeah. The chat stays there. But it's a good question.
How's everyone doing? Everyone's so quiet.
Doing great.
Doing good.
How are you eating? Wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without that.
A meeting within a meeting.
Michael, we are all ears.
There we go.
Very good. So what time is it? Let's give it a 2:05 so we get all the stragglers.
What's up, David Martinez?
Wow, David Martinez wearing
David Martinez in the
tie.
house.
How you doing?
He's wearing a tie at his home office. That's called commitment to excellence right there.
It's called mindset.
You're in my center square.
Yeah. See, there's a reason why he came on today.
Hello, everybody. Do we expect this to be an hour meeting?
An hour and a half for you, Kathy.
Yeah.
All right.
Michael, how long?
I mean, whenever Jeff's got to go. How about that? We're here.
It shouldn't be more than 5 hours.
Right.
There we go.
I know we did, Jeff. We asked agents to submit questions, so if there are.
Okay.
I'll let you know. But do you want to maybe just you'll start doing your presentation and then
Sure.
we'll do questions after or take them as they come up?
You can, if you can check the chat box or Q&A, whatever you're using for questions,
All
you
right.
can feel free to interrupt me as I'm going through like as I finish each section, we should stop for questions because it's better to answer the questions as we're going through than, waiting till the end because they might forget.
That works. So
Yeah,
yeah,
so it should take about an hour, but it depends on the questions. It might run a little bit longer based on questions. So, and then Michael, you can share this, you can share the screen when I want you to.
yes, with your handout.
Yeah. So why don't you, if you can, go ahead and share the screen with the handout. If it doesn't work, that's no big, yeah, that's it. So this is just a handout. This is basically what we're going to cover in the next hour or so. We're first going to go through the new forms releases for June and also for December, which I don't think they've either just come out or they're about to come out this week. Usually it's the second week of December that the December forms come out. So we'll cover that. Then we're going to cover some of the new laws that impact real estate and that you might be interested in for 2021. We'll give you a little bit of an update on COVID forms, talk a little bit about open houses. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the new couple of things that happened with NAR and the Department of Justice that just happened within the last week or so. So going back to, you can go to the next page now. And this is just for your own information. If you want information on the new forms that come out, CAR always puts out a quick summary. And this is the quick summary you can find at car.org for the June release. And then there's also one for the December release, which is, like I said, just about to come out. So I'm going to cover not the revisions, but I'm going to cover the new forms. So you can drop down. I just want to show you what those forms are. And you can find them at car.org. And there's the December releases. There's only really 2 new forms for December. And then go down a little bit further and we're going to go to the first form. So the first one is the square footage and lot size disclosure and advisory. And I'll ask Michael, I don't know if your office is mandating the use of this form or how you're handling that.
It is. So we originally made our own broker office version, and then now we're just replacing it with this one.
Okay, so I'm just going to briefly discuss the use of this form and when you have to use it for sure. Anytime there's a discrepancy between the square footage that's in the MLS and the square footage in public records or the square footage in your flyer, you have to disclose that discrepancy. Now, legally, you wouldn't have to use this form. You could use just a disclosure that's signed by the buyer indicating that there's a discrepancy, but that's what this form was designed for, to show that if there's a discrepancy. So anytime you have, let's say your square footage shows 2,500 in the MLS, but the public record shows 2,000, this is the form you can use that has all the disclaimer language and a place for you to fill in what the public record shows and what the MLS shows or what the seller's saying or whatever. So if you don't have a discrepancy, then technically you wouldn't have to use this form, but your office may want you to use it anyway because it has a lot of disclaimers in it. So if you only have, if your public record and the MLS were the same, then you could just fill out the form saying public record 2,500 square feet, MLS 2,500, and leave it at that. So I think it's a good form to use whether there's a discrepancy or not, but it's absolutely positively critical that you have a written disclaimer signed by the buyer anytime there is a discrepancy between the square footage that you're pushing out there, either in a flyer or MLS, and the square footage in the public records, because there's numerous lawsuits that went against the seller and against the broker when the discrepancy wasn't disclosed. So that's the first form that's been out since June. Any questions? And again, this, any questions on the form? If you don't see anything, we'll just go to the next one. If there's any questions, I'll take them now. No? Okay. Okay, the next form is unfortunately entitled the Property Visit and Open House Advisory. This form came out right around the time of, or was designed right around the time that COVID started, even though it was put out in June. And we tried to get them to change the name and get rid of the open house part of it because you can't do open houses now. And it's really not an open house advisory. What it really is a property visit advisory. So I don't know, again, whether your office requires this form to be used or not, but it's a good form to use for 2 reasons. First of all, it explains to the buyer that there are recording devices in the house sometimes, and they shouldn't be discussing anything with their buyer's agent, which is confidential. So this comes from a fairly infamous situation up north where a buyer and the buyer's agent were discussing making an offer on the property in the house, and something along the lines of the buyer saying, well, I'll offer 3.5 million, but I'll go to 3.7. Well, the seller had a recording device in the house and heard the whole thing. So what do you think the seller countered at? So you need to be, it's kind of like, don't be stupid, this form. Don't be discussing, what your buyer's going to offer or anything like that in the house, because people have, almost everybody now has recording devices. So that's what it says in paragraph 1. But paragraph 2 talks about safety. And it basically just explains that when you're in somebody else's house, that, you're not necessarily familiar with the house. There may be a handrail, or there may be a step down living room or something. And you just need to be careful going through the house. So that's what this form is designed for. You can ignore the fact that it says open house advisory. I don't know why they had to say that, because again, it really has nothing to do with open houses. It has to do with a buyer visiting any house, whether it's open or not. So it's a good form to use. It's not mandated by CAR. It's certainly not legally mandated. I would leave it up to the office whether they want you to have this form as something that's signed. But we have had some issues with buyers. In paragraph 2, it talks about booties, and I've heard of some cases, not our clients, but some cases where people put booties on and then they slipped because the booties were slippery and they got hurt at the property. So this is just kind of advisory to buyers, which I think is probably a good idea to use. So if there's any questions on that, I'll be more than happy to take them. If not, we'll move along to the next form.
So Jeff.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, if we use this form, you're saying that it should be signed when we get a PED form, pretty much.
Yeah.
In advance of a showing.
Sure. You want to sign it before they're in the house. Absolutely. So that'd be a good time to have it signed before the PED form is signed. Now, you don't have to have this one signed every time, though. The PED form you have to have signed every time you go into a different property. This one you don't need to have signed every time. You just have it signed once and put it in your file.
Got it. Michael, is this something that we're using for the office, or is it just up to us as individuals?
I mean, I think it's not mandatory yet. I mean, we have plenty of forms. As Jeff said, if it becomes a situation where it does become mandatory, we will. But right now, it's just good to know that the form exists.
And it's certainly not a bad idea to use it, but again, it's not mandatory at this point. So
The
moving along.
fact that we're using a lot of booties, I think we should get in the habit of getting it signed to protect us from slips.
If you have a property where you use booties for people to walk through, then I would absolutely use this form.
Okay, we'll
Thanks.
add it to our list. There you go.
Okay, next form is the transfer disclosure statement. This is a revision. The only reason that I've included this is that this form was revised earlier this year to add the third box. You see where my little squiggly is there? To add that third box that says no substitute disclosure for this transfer. This is just a mess. What happened was, before the third box was added in there, the sellers would fill out the TDS and they would routinely not check anything in section 1, right? You would just leave it blank. Nobody paid much attention to it. Well, then some clever plaintiff attorneys figured out that if every section isn't completed, that according to the contract, the buyer still has a 5-day rescission period when they receive a TDS that's not complete. And they were claiming it wasn't complete because the box wasn't checked. Kind of a shitty argument, but it's still an argument. So to combat that argument, CAR added in the third box, which says no substitute disclosure for this transfer. And you can get into, we've had hours of discussion with other attorneys about what a substitute disclosure is or it isn't. And for your purposes, you can pretty much ignore all the legal discussion and just most of the time, just have your seller check the third box saying no substitute disclosure for this transfer. Because if you check the box, right? If you check a box, in this case, if you check the last box, no substitute disclosure, you've completed section 1. So you don't have to worry about that argument that the form isn't complete because section 1 was left blank. Now, you may have disclosures that you're giving. You might have an inspection report that the seller is giving that they did, or a termite report, or an asbestos report. And you're going to give those reports anyway because they're required by law to disclose, right? But it doesn't make any difference in this form whether you check the box saying that you're attaching substitute disclosures or there's no substitute disclosures. Just make sure a box is checked by the seller and then you're going to give all the forms along with the CAR form that's receipt for report form. And to be honest, my opinion is that all these, like an inspection report or a report like that, it's really not a substitute disclosure, because the seller still has the disclosure obligation to disclose anything they know. And just because you have an inspection report, it doesn't mean that's substituting for what the seller knows. The seller may know things that the inspector didn't see. So really, most reports, they're not really substitute disclosures. They're just reports that you're giving to the buyer. So
What about NHD reports?
the NHD truly is a substitute disclosure, because the seller would have no idea whether the property is in one of those zones. So if you're giving that report, that truly is a substitute disclosure. So you could theoretically check the box saying inspection reports completed pursuant to this contract of sale. And then you could include the NHD if you have it at that time. But it already says under substitute disclosures, the following disclosures and other disclosures by law, including the NHD, blah, 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 blah. So even if when you're giving the NHD, even if you check no substitute disclosures for this transfer, you're still going to give the NHD report, and the buyer's still going to have the right to approve or disapprove. But if you wanted to, you could check either of any one of those three boxes and just write in there that if you're giving the NHD at the time of the avid, that the NHD report is attached. So any which way, the important thing is check a box. Now, I will tell you that CAR is trying to get all of Section 1 just removed from the form. But remember that this is a statutory form from the legislature, not from CAR. So CAR just can't make changes to the form without the legislature's approval. But the legislator, the head guy at CAR, seems to think that the legislature may not have any problem removing this. So it may be in the future that Section 1 just disappears altogether, which in my opinion would be a good thing, because it just creates confusion.
I have
Okay.
a question. So it's come up, I have an agent that's representing buyers, and she was having a hard time getting the TDS or, SPQ from the listing agent. He was non-responsive. The sellers were non-responsive.
Yeah.
What can we do as the buyers?
You give if you can't get the TDS or SPQ, then you can give a notice to seller to perform. And the notice to seller to perform is a notice to seller to perform. And if they don't perform within 2 days, then the buyer theoretically, if they wanted to, they could cancel. So,
But
yeah,
if they don't want to cancel and they
that's
did,
that's a different problem. So you give the notice to seller to perform. And if the seller still doesn't give the form, then you as the buyer still have that open cancellation right once you get it. So it actually works to your advantage that you haven't gotten it, because your right to rescind the contract is still open until such time as you do get it. And I would suggest that if you're in that situation, that you contact the manager or the broker of that office, because there's no excuse for delaying that form and not giving it. It's critical that it's given. And if you're having trouble with an agent, just call the manager or the broker of the office.
and what if the manager or broker of the other office is still unresponsive?
Then you have to explain. If you can't get the seller to release the form, then I'd give a notice to seller to perform. If they don't give you the form, then I'd go back to the buyer and say, okay, buyer, we gave the notice to perform. They're not giving the form. What do you want to do? Do you want to cancel or do you want to go forward? If you go forward, you have to understand that they have a statutory requirement to give you the form and they haven't given it to you.
And just have a paper trail.
Yeah, you want absolutely, you want a paper trail. You don't want it all verbal. You want a paper trail explaining everything as you go along. Okay?
So Jeff, just either way, as long as we check that third box,
Yeah,
we're covered in all situations.
yeah, as long as you check the third box, you're covered as far as that section being complete. So they can't argue. They could argue that TDS is complete for other reasons in section 2. But the section 1 is complete. And again, regardless of what box you check, you know that the seller has to deliver all the reports they have, and you would do that with the receipt for report form.
One question from the square footage form. I don't know if it was answered. If the seller had a space added without a permit, should we use this form? I would say probably.
Sure.
Yes.
Absolutely. And not only that, not only are you using the form, but you're also going to have a disclosure, obviously, that there in the TDS, there's a question, was there anything added without permits? You're going to check the box yes, and you're going to explain what was done without permits. You absolutely have to do that. Okay, the next form is the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory Form. This form came out recently, just last month. It is now auto-populated with the listing agreement, the purchase contract, the lease agreement, the lease listing agreement. It auto-populates with everything. And it's basically a disclosure to everyone about the fair housing law and discrimination law. And if Michael, if you drop down to paragraph 8, that's the one that's created the most discussion. And that has to do with buyer love letters, you know, quote unquote, the letters that the buyers write saying, you know, we love your house. We're a lovely family with 3 kids, blah, 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 you know. And in the olden days meaning a couple of years ago, I guess, I think everybody did that without even thinking twice about it. I mean, a lot of people submitted these letters. Well, now that fair housing is more on the forefront, I guess, than maybe has been in the past, it's come to the attention of people that items contained in those letters, if used by a seller to decide who to sell to, could very well be discriminatory. So if you give a letter that has a picture of the buyers, right away, you've potentially given the seller something that they're not supposed to consider. You got a picture of the buyers. You're seeing their race. You're seeing whether it's a family or a single person. You're seeing things that fall under the discriminatory protection areas. So you really should not be giving a picture of the family. And the letter itself is going to have stuff in it. Now, if the letter just says, we love your house, we love what you did with the kitchen, we love the neighborhood, that's fine. But you know, these letters, they almost always say things like, we're a lovely family with 3 kids. Well, right away, boom, you have an issue that if the seller were using it to decide who to sell to, like if they had 2 offers, one was from a single person, one was from this lovely family, they could file a discrimination claim. But everybody's gotten confused about this. So a lot of people now think that these letters are illegal and that they're prohibited. No, they're not illegal. They're not prohibited. If the buyer wants to submit the letter, they can. But as a buyer's agent, because this form auto-populates with the purchase agreement, you should discuss it with the buyer right at the time you're writing the offer and say to the buyer, look, you know, if they bring it up at all, if they don't bring it up, don't worry about it. But if they bring it up, they want to submit a letter, I think you refer them to paragraph 8 and let them read it and go, look, you can submit a letter, but I just want you to know that the seller is not obligated to look at your letter. And the seller may tell the listing broker they don't want to see your letter because there may be things in your letter that the seller is not allowed to look at or not allowed to use in deciding whether to sell. So let's flip over to the listing side. You're the listing broker. And when you take a listing now, this form is going to auto-populate. So that's the time when you're taking a listing that you should have the discussion with the seller and say, okay, seller, I just want you to know that when offers come in, they may include these letters. And you can refer them to paragraph 8, let them read paragraph 8A and say that these letters may contain information that you are not supposed to use in making a decision to sell to any particular buyer. And you would probably be better off not seeing these at all, so nobody can make a claim later on that you discriminated. And then it's up to the seller to say to you, yes, I want to see them, or no, I don't. And you just want to have a paper trail with the seller. So if the seller says to you, I do not want to see these after you've had the discussion at the time of listing, just send an email to the seller saying, as per our discussion, you've indicated that if I get an offer with a buyer letter, introductory letter attached, you are advising me not to deliver that letter to you, and I will not do so. You're done. If they say to you, we do want to see them, then you should have an email to them saying, you basically, you've indicated that if the buyer has an introductory letter, you do want to see that, despite the fact that I've indicated to you that there may be information in those letters that you are not to use in deciding whether to sell the property to a buyer, and then refer them again to paragraph 8A of the fair housing form. So I just got one of the managers of one of the other offices saying to me, do I know if CAR has prohibited the use of letters? No, CAR doesn't prohibit anything. Agents don't prohibit anything. It's the buyer and seller. It's up to the principals. If the buyer wants to submit it, they can. As a buyer's agent, I would probably discourage it, but if they want to do it, who do you represent? You represent them. So you do it. But as a listing agent, you want to make sure you have the discussion with the seller and advise the seller that it's probably a bad idea, and then just have a paper trail whether they've agreed to see them or not. Okay, any questions on that?
A quick question, Jeff.
You have a PhD
I'm sorry, what?
I think you have to have a PhD in communication on this one. Sorry.
Yeah, you do. You do, but the bottom line is that, especially with the seller, that you just want to have a paper trail with the seller stating, yeah, show them to me, or no, don't show them to me, and have a discussion with them. Because
Jeff, is it required to send a letter through if it's written by a buyer's agent, if you're the
No.
listing agent?
No, it's not required. Again, it's up to the seller whether they want to see them. And if the seller says to you, no, I don't want to see them, then you are not required to submit them because you represent the seller. But the problem with that is you have to have a discussion with the seller up front to find out whether they want to see them or not. Because if you get an offer and the buyer submits a letter with it and you haven't had a discussion with the seller, then you have to have a discussion at that point because you have to have a discussion before you give it to the seller. So the best time to do it, because the form prints out automatically with the listing agreement anyway, is at the very time you're taking the listing.
Hey, Jeff, what's the difference between if you have that conversation with your seller, do you or do you not want to receive these letters?
Yeah.
Versus you have 10 showings on the property, and after each showing, connect with your client and they say, hey, how did it go? What did they think of the house? In the course of those conversations, you usually say, you know, they loved it, they love the pool, they love the swing set in the backyard for their kids. Just by virtue of talking about how a showing went, you are giving or sharing certain information about the family that while it's not in writing, it still could be.
Yeah,
you know,
and the seller, and a lot of times the seller's home, so they see the buyer.
Right, exactly.
I mean, you know, so you can only do what you can do. I mean, there's a limit on how ridiculous this whole thing gets. I'll tell you how ridiculous it may be getting is that it looks like they're you know, are you all familiar with the Glide platform now? Glide
Yes.
real estate. They're considering, I don't know if they're going to do it, but they're considering when an offer is submitted that the offer would be written, but the name would be whited out. So you couldn't tell from, because sometimes you can tell from a name what race the people might be.
Oh, that's.
So I mean, it's endless, you know, but all you can do.
They're turning into robots soon, so.
Yeah. All you can do is really do your best. And Howie, I agree with you that you're going to give some information to the seller, you know, about these people. But just, you know, because paragraph 8A is there, it does explain to the seller they can't use those, or they shouldn't be using those reasons to accept or not accept an offer.
Got it.
I mean, nothing's changed over the years. They never were supposed to use that as a reason. It's just that it, you know, with technology and forms and everything else, it's gotten more complicated, but they never were supposed to use those reasons to not go with a particular buyer, and they're still not.
Thank you.
On a similar question, you know, similar topic, discussing offers with sellers. So a lot of times buyers agents will complain that they feel like their buyer's offer is not being presented to the seller.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to know what, you know, what could they do? Obviously, you know, a buyer's agent can't reach out to the seller.
No, but they're in the purchase agreement now. On the last page, page 10, there is a statement that says that at the request of the buyer's agent, the listing agent must disclose in writing whether they've submitted the offer. And there's a place on that page 10 for the listing agent to initial saying they submitted the offer, and a place for the seller to initial saying they rejected the offer. If you request, there's no automatic right, but according to the page 10 of the contract now, if you as a buyer's agent or as a buyer request that information, the listing agent is required to give you that information.
And the remedy to a buyer's agent, if they're not provided, they could potentially go to the board and file.
They could do, the first thing I would do is, once again, is call the manager of the office or the broker and say your agent isn't cooperating, and hopefully the agent isn't the manager of the office. And then if that doesn't work, and ultimately you could go to the board and you know, make a grievance, because it violates the ethics. If you ask for it, you're supposed to get an answer. Okay, we got one more form, and the last form is either just coming out or it hasn't quite come out yet. It's the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory. This one's a doozy, but it's pretty complicated. But first of all, it only applies if the property is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. So the question is your property in a high or very high hazard severity zone? You would determine that by the natural hazard disclosure statement would indicate whether the property was in that. So if the property is not in a high or very high hazard zone, you don't need to use this form. I can't tell you which areas are or are not in high or very high.
Most of the canyons are.
What's
in
that?
LA. Most of the canyons in LA, Beverly Hills, Hollywood Hills, Brentwood, they're in the high zone.
They may be, and in which case you would use the form. So if the seller is in a high or very high fire hazard zone, if you go down the page a little bit, Michael, you'll see item number 3, and those are the questions that the seller has to answer. Now, it's very likely the seller won't know the answer to the questions, but it does say that the seller is aware of the following. So it's one of those things where you're not saying yes or no for sure. It's just whether the seller is aware or not. And so they're supposed to answer whether, whether the eave or roof ventilation have openings in excess, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I've lived in my house for 30 years. I couldn't answer these questions. There's no duty on the part of the seller to investigate these things necessarily. They're just answering the questions to the best of their knowledge. CAR will be, I don't think they've done it yet, but they will be putting out a Q&A on this. They may have already done it. And I would suggest that you take a look at the Q&A because it'll answer a lot of the questions. But this is the form. It goes into effect the law goes into effect January 1st, 2021. There's a separate part of the form that goes in, not the form, there's a separate part of the law that goes into effect in July of next year, which isn't home hardening, but it has to do with any items that are adjacent to the property that could cause fires, like weeds and things like that. That part of the law goes into effect July 1st. This part and this form is just for June 1st. And again, if you're in an area, the seller is in an area of high or very high fire hazard, then they're required to answer these questions. And again, we've got a little bit of time. We got a few weeks before it goes into effect. And I'm pretty certain the CAR will put out a Q&A that explains this a little bit better.
And it's for 1 to 4 units.
It
says,
yeah, right there, required residential 1 to 4, yeah.
And
and before January 1st, 2010. So if the property was built after 2010, theoretically it has the fire safety devices and you wouldn't need the form. So it's 1 to 4 unit residential built before January 1st, 2010.
I thought I remember them saying there was a website that you can go on and determine if the property was in a high zone.
There may be, I mean, the National Hazard Disclosure Statement would have that, but there may also be a website that would accomplish the same thing.
And if you're in a border area, it's okay to still use it. If you're in doubt, use it.
When you're in doubt, use it. But when you're in doubt, use it. But you want to make sure that the seller, just doesn't willy-nilly fill the form out, that they actually read it and check the box if it's appropriate. Like B says, roof coverings made of untreated wood shingles or shakes. They should know the answer to that. Combustible landscaping or other materials within 5 feet of the home. Single pane or non-tempered glass windows. I mean, I'm sure a lot of properties have that. Loose or missing bird stopping or roof flashing, rain gutters without metal or non-combustible gut, so.
It's like the earthquake form, but.
Yeah, kind of. But on the earthquake form, the difference is on the earthquake form, there's actually a box that you check says do not know, right? Remember? Whereas in this one, it doesn't have that box. It just says, are you aware? It would be nicer if it was yes, no, not aware, so you could check a not aware. But in this case, if you don't check something, you're saying you're not aware.
Is this a statutory form also?
Yes. Yeah, this form will be required for 1 to 4 unit residential built prior to January 1st, 2010. So that's all we need the
handout
screen for. And now we're going to flip over to some of the new CAR laws that not CAR laws, but the laws that go into effect January 1st, 2021 or beyond. So there's not that many that are going to be significant to you, but the first one I would mention is that there's a new law that goes into effect January 1st. It's actually AB 3182, and it has to do with condominiums and PUDs and restrictions on rentals. And the new law that goes into effect January 1st says that an HOA cannot limit the number of rentals in a complex to less than 25%. So if you have an HOA document that says there are no rentals allowed as of January 1st, that would be invalid. They have to allow at least 25% rentals. Also, if you already are renting your property and the HOA puts in a restriction on rentals, you are grandfathered in if you've already rented the property prior to the HOA putting a restriction in. So if there's no restriction in the HOA and you're renting your property and then all of a sudden the HOA comes up with restrictions saying not more than 50% or whatever can be rented, they can't knock yours out because you are grandfathered in prior to them putting in a restriction. But the law states they cannot, under any circumstances, have any kind of a restriction for less than 25% occupancy by renters. Okay, that does not include ADUs, by the way. If you're living in the main structure and you have an ADU and you're in a condo complex or a PUD, that's not considered a rental for purposes of this law because you're living in the main structure. Okay.
Is this the whole state or just LA?
No, this is statewide. This is AB 3182. This is the state of California.
So Beverly Hills obviously included.
Well, if Beverly Hills is in California, I would say it was included. I know some of you in Beverly Hills think that you're not part of the state, but as far as I know, last time I checked, you guys were. So yeah, you'd be part of the state. Until you secede, you're part of the state.
Quick question. Some of the condos, especially on Wilshire Corridor, they have a rule that you cannot rent it out for 1 year or 2 years before you want to move in. What about that?
Well, the ordinance, you can restrict, one thing you can restrict is you can restrict vacation rentals, like for 30 days or less, you can still do that. But as far as a restriction, I didn't quite understand it. So they're saying that you can't rent it out for the first year or two?
Yes, they say you can't rent it for 1 year. After that, if you want to rent it, you can.
That's a CC&R rule, you know.
Yeah, but the CC&R rule would be superseded by this AB 3182, and I'm not so sure that I guess the question would be, does that somehow interfere with the 25% rule? Because if nobody can rent out a place for a year or two, it may violate that. When you get into something like that, you just need to refer your client. Don't give me legal advice. You just need to refer your client to a real estate attorney and let them figure it out. I have a real estate attorney who specializes in HOAs if you ever need that. But that's kind of a tricky one. And I'm not exactly sure that this ordinance goes directly to that. But it seems like it could violate it if it violates the 25% rule.
Thank you.
Sure. The second thing I wanted to mention was, and you're all familiar with this, I think by now, is Prop 19. So Prop 19 passed, and Prop 19, most of Prop 19 goes into effect April 1st, 2021. And Prop 19 is the proposition that says now that if you're 55 years of age or older, and some of us will at some point be 55 years of age or older, certainly not me, but I've got many years before that happens, but some of you are going to be 55 at some point. So the new law says that you can take your old tax bases with you, even if you are buying up, and no matter what county you're moving to in California. The old rule was that if you were 55 or older, you could take your tax bases with you if you were buying down in price, and only to a county that approved Prop 60. Now the new law says that if you're 55 or older, and it also includes disabled people, and it includes people that were a subject of a disaster, a natural disaster, and those people are all thrown into the same category, and they can take their tax bases with them to a new property anywhere in California, no matter what the county is, and they can buy up. But if you buy up, there's a blended rate that it's a little complicated, and you may need a PhD for this one too, Josh. But the way it works is if you're buying up, so from the original thing to like if you're buying them from $1 million to $1.1 million, the $1 million goes with the old tax basis, but the extra 100,000, that little portion gets taxed at the new basis. So it's like a blended rate. Again, do not give clients tax advice or legal advice on this. You obviously need to refer them to their accountant or their CPA or whatever to get advice. But that's the way Prop 19 works. Now, there's another element of Prop 19 which isn't so good, and that's the element that was put into the bill to get the bill passed, which is the intergenerational transfer, where a father or parents can give their property to their kids or grandkids. And now the way it works is the only way that they could take their tax bases with from parent to child or grandparent to grandchild is if it's going to be owner occupied by the grandkids or the kids. If it's not going to be owner occupied, it's considered a business and they're going to get taxed. Now a lot of people say, well, why does CAR sponsor a bill like that? And just quickly, the reason CAR sponsored the bill with that in there is the only way it was going to pass. This bill came up 2 years ago and it failed. And the only way they could get support for the bill to pass was to include, number one, disaster victims in this and disabled people, and number two, to include this intergenerational transfer. And CAR felt that it was going to happen anyway at some point, that the legislature was sooner or later going to attack the intergenerational transfer and the tax on it. And so they just decided to do it in this bill so they get the bill passed. So it comes with good and bad, hopefully more good than bad.
So
I
basically
have one
kids and
question.
I have a
grandkids-
question.
Wait, one at a time.
Sorry, I have a question to ask.
Go ahead.
John T, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I don't know, Michael, did you ask my question or not? I was a little late, but
We haven't got to COVID yet, so just hold on.
Yeah, why don't you save COVID for a little later?
Yeah.
I have a question about this
Okay,
intergenerational transfer.
Okay.
If there's several children or several grandkids, are they all required to live on the premises in order to get the tax preferential treatment?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ask your accountant and your tax advisor. The law is that it has to be owner occupied. I don't know how that would work if it was transferred to 3 different people, one of which owner occupied and the others didn't.
Like
So
3
just-
children or 3 grandchildren, right?
Yeah, so just that's something that the accountants and the tax advisors will be up to date on when the law goes into play. Actually, that part of the law goes into effect sooner than the other part. The Prop 19 part with the transfer, if you're buying up, if you're 55 or older or whatever, that goes into effect April 1st. But I believe that the intergenerational transfer part goes into effect right away. So any questions with regarding that, you just don't answer those. Just refer them to their accountant or their tax advisor.
One question, Jeff. So in order to take advantage of this law, does the sale need to happen after April 1st,
Yeah,
2021?
That's a great question. And the answer, it's been asked to CAR Legal, and they are a little, they're not quite sure. It would seem that it would be logical that all that would have to happen after April 1st would be the close, not the opening of escrow. But again, there is some question about it because, when they pass these laws, they don't cross their T's and dot their I's. And so there's some question as to that. So you do not want to be advising your clients. Just get them to their accountant and their tax advisor and let them advise. CAR's position is that probably you're okay if both the other question is, how about the sale and the purchase? Do they both have to happen after April 1st, but there's only the purchase app? So those are questions that are not answered directly in the black and white of the law, and that's going to have to be figured out, and you need to advise them to talk to their accountant or tax advisor before they do anything in that regard.
How long do they have between the sale of their property and the purchase for this to be able to apply?
I think that's still 2 years. I don't think that's changed any. By the way, there will be, if there isn't already, CAR will have a Q&A on Prop 19. I think they may already have it. And those are always really good because they're very thorough, and they're pages and pages of explanation as to what you can do and what everything means. So when you have a chance, you could go to car.org and check out the Q&A on that.
Thank you.
Let's see.
And we'll probably have many people claiming they're living in the property for a year, the grandkids or the kids.
Right. Yeah, again, all that stuff you need to stay away from that. You just need to, you can advise them of the law. You can give them a copy of the Q&A from CAR when it's out. That's fine. But you don't give them any advice. You just have their accountant or their tax advisor advise them what they can and can't do in that regard, because you don't want to get caught in the middle of that. The other change, the other law that goes into effect is I don't know that any of you necessarily deal with this on a daily basis, but there's something called a homestead protection, whereby if you're an owner occupier of a property, a certain amount of money, a certain amount of your equity in your property is protected from any kind of a judgment. So somebody who gets a judgment against you can't foreclose on you unless the judgment is greater than the homestead amount. And in the past, I think the homestead amount was $75,000 for an individual and maybe $150,000 for a couple. That's been dramatically changed, and it now goes up to a maximum of $600,000 That's the homestead exemption, which would protect you. So if somebody gets a judgment for less than $600,000, they still owe it, but you can't foreclose on them and take away their primary residence.
Does that include
so
tax liens, property tax, or IRS, or state?
I'm sorry, what?
Does that include tax judgments, or?
No, I don't think. I think it deals with third-party judgment. I don't think it necessarily deals with tax liens. Anything from the federal government or the state government. And again, there'll be a Q&A. CAR will put a Q&A out on that. Just for your own information, I know that you really care about this, but the Department of Business Oversight, which used to be the Department of Corporations, is changing its name again, and it's now going to be the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation. It doesn't affect you directly because you are under the Department of Real Estate, but this is the department, the new Department of Financial Protection and Innovation is the department that would protect third parties, consumers from any kind of fraud, mortgage fraud or whatever. So that name is changing again. So you won't see the Department of Business Oversight anymore. It'll be the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation. So, there's another law on PACE liens. Are you all familiar with PACE liens? PACE liens are liens that right now are like super liens for upgrading your property with environmentally
hero liens.
Yeah, exactly, hero liens, and upgrading your property with energy efficiency. The problem with these is that they turned out to be super liens that are superior to not to tax liens, but they're superior to a loan or a mortgage. And if you have one of these PACE liens and you go to sell your property, it may have to be paid off in full. Otherwise, you won't be able to get a lender to lend on it because they don't want to be in second position. So there's a new law with regard to PACE liens that basically it's AB 1551, which said, I mean, it's not to me, it's not going as far as it's supposed to. It just says that anytime you're doing a PACE lien, the consumer has to get a paper copy of the disclosure with regard to these liens and what it means. But I think behind the scenes, they're working on getting rid of the super status of these PACE liens. So I wouldn't be surprised if up the road, somehow the super status of these PACE liens was done away with and they weren't superior necessarily to, a new mortgage on the property. So that's pretty much, there are some other things, but those are the main topics. So I wanted to move along to the next topic, which has to do with COVID. And now you had if you want, I'll answer that COVID question.
So it comes up a lot. In fact, today, one of our agents has either a listing or they're representing a buyer, and they're trying to get into a tenant-occupied property, and the tenant is not allowing it. And if a seller wants to sell and wants to allow prospective purchasers inside, and the tenant refuses, there's not much that can be done right now.
That's right. That's an easy answer. There's nothing. If a tenant won't let you in, you can't get in. Now you may, the old carrot and the stick. You don't have a stick anymore. You might want to use a carrot, and you might want to say, well, tenant, if you cooperate, I'll reduce your rent by X or whatever, and do something financially will get the tenant to cooperate. But right now, if the tenant doesn't cooperate, you're not going to be able to get anybody into the property. You can't enter the property without the tenant's permission.
So you need that in writing, and a PEAD form would suffice. The PEADLR.
Well, if the tenant signs a PEAD form, you would think that they're indicating that it's okay to allow access to the property. But I would still get something, like a subsequent email saying, "Thank you for the PEAD form. As you've indicated, you're allowing entry." A paper trail showing that they're allowing entry, so they don't come back later and say, "I never said you could get into my property." And the eviction laws. There's a state eviction law now, but there's still local eviction laws in the county of LA and the city of LA. And right now, to the best of my knowledge, you really can't do an eviction in LA County for any reason other than health and safety still. The state ordinance is looser. You can actually do an eviction for certain reasons, but under the local LA City, LA County ordinance, my understanding is that you're pretty limited. I've given before the name of a company on the west side. In fact, they're within a couple blocks of your office, SII Real Estate Services. Michael, do you have that?
Yeah, and I've posted it.
Yeah, so that's a company that they do landlord evictions, and you don't want to get in the middle of a landlord-tenant dispute at this point or giving any advice on that because the law is just so complicated. Just get them to either this SII Real Estate Services, which could advise them, or like the law office of Dennis Block. I get a lot of questions about landlord-tenant stuff. I'm not going to advise your clients on landlord-tenant. I don't do landlord-tenant every day. It's extremely complicated. It's changing all the time. They need to talk to somebody who specializes in landlord-tenant, who knows exactly what's going on. And that's why SII Real Estate Services or the law offices of Dennis Block would be two good resources for your clients. Do not get in the middle of that. Don't be giving notices to tenants on, on behalf of your client, unless you're a property manager, and none of you should be doing property management through Keller Williams, Beverly Hills.
So if we're representing a buyer and we want to, that's purchasing a property that's tenant occupied and the buyer wants to do inspections and can't do it, they could cancel the contract.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly have the right to, if you can't do your inspections, you certainly have a right to cancel the, you have a contingency for your inspections. If you can't inspect, you can cancel, get your deposit back, but you're not going to be able to force the issue until we're beyond this problem with, landlord tenant evictions and ability to evict. Now, the state law right now has a carve out that CAR got put into the state law, which says that if you're selling your property and you enter into a contract with a buyer and the buyer is going to own or occupy, that you can actually give notice to a tenant that's valid to get them out. But the problem is the local laws are different than that. And the LA County and city law now don't really allow that. So if you were in an area, let's say you were in Bakersfield or something, and they didn't have a local ordinance and all they had was a state ordinance, technically you could get a tenant out if you were going to sell the property, you're under contract and the buyer is going to own or occupy. But unfortunately, that's superseded right now by the LA County and LA City ordinances.
And that's in place definitely until the end of February?
Yeah, I think now, they're all different. I think now I think it's the end of February. And my guess is going to be, just the way things are going, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if all that's extended until we're at a point where we got vaccines and things going on. Because it's been extended more than once already. I think originally it was September, then it went November, then it went February. So it keeps getting extended. So just on the issue of coronavirus, you all saw the latest safer at home ordinance that went into effect yesterday or day before. It doesn't directly impact your ability to show property. You're an essential service. You can still show property. You still have to follow all the guidelines. You still need to do exactly what you were supposed to be doing before with disinfecting the property and wearing masks and only having, under LA City and county ordinance, only having a maximum of two related buyers in the property at the same time. The seller shouldn't be there during the showings. Everything's pretty much the same as it was. That could change. It could get worse. But right now, you're an essential service and you can do your business as usual. You need to be extremely careful. I would suggest to you right now that the less showings you do in person, the better off you are from a health standpoint. Anything you can do virtually right now, I would do first. Any requirements about pre-qualification letters or approval of some kind of funds of the buyer, your seller can certainly ask for that before a property is shown. It's not you as a listing agent that require that, it's the seller. So if you talk to a seller and the seller says, I don't want anybody in my property unless we have a pre-qualification letter and proof of funds, then you can, as long as you do that with every buyer and you don't pick and choose, that you can do, and you can make that requirement. And until you get that, you don't have to show the property. So I would be extremely careful right now about showing properties. I'd be extremely careful about going into the office, if your office even lets you go into the office. If you're in the office, you should be wearing a mask all the time. Even if you're in your own office and your door's closed, I think technically you can take the mask off, but as soon as you walk out of the office or open the door, you have to have the mask on. It's getting worse, not better. And anything that the real estate industry does that is perceived as careless, they will clamp down and you won't be able to show property anymore. So right now, nothing's changed, but it is certainly subject to changing as things get worse before they get better. You still have to use the PED form. Hold on for 1 second. You still need to use the PED form before any showing. The PED form should be signed the day you're doing the showing, but if you have it signed within 24 hours of the showing, that should be adequate. But if you're showing the property 4 days later or different property, you should have a new P form signed. You should still be discussing the CVA form, the coronavirus addendum, with buyers at the time they make an offer to see if they want to include it with their offer. It's an optional form. It's up to the buyer and seller, but you as a buyer's agent should at least be discussing it with your buyer to see if they want to use the form. We just had a situation where the buyer wants to cancel now, not your office, but a different office. Buyer wants to cancel because of coronavirus. The CVA was not used, and the agent never discussed the CVA with the buyer, so that could be a problem. It should be discussed. It's optional, but it needs to be discussed so the buyer can make a decision whether to include it with the offer, and then the seller can make a decision whether they're willing to let it be included with the offer.
So we
have a
we
paper
have
trail on that.
Just one second. We have a Keller Williams Beverly Hills disclosure that says that you've brought that up with your boss.
Yeah, I think we designed something for you guys that you're using. So yeah, absolutely. You want to use that. The posted entry form is the same. It has been. You still have to post it on the door. The RLA CAA, there's a residential listing agreement coronavirus addendum that should be used with all listings now. I think it may auto-populate with the listing. I'm not sure, but you should use it because it's the form that explains to the seller at the time you're listing the property all about coronavirus and the PED and the office policy on showings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really nothing has changed in regard to the usage of the forms. Believe it or not, the forms haven't been revised in several weeks, maybe almost a month now, which is pretty unusual. At one point they were getting revised every couple of days. But make sure you use zip forms because they have the latest version of all the forms. That kind of leads into open houses and delivering things to the property. With regard to open houses, the health department, the state health department, and Cal OSHA has made it even clearer now that you are not to do open houses. They've actually put it in writing now. CIR Legal said it is in writing in the newest Safer at Home ordinance that you are not to have any open houses, period. That doesn't mean that you can't show property by appointment, and you could still put something on social media that says the property will be shown between 2 and 5 o'clock on Sunday by appointment only. That's fine. That's not an open house. Don't use the words open house. Technically, you could still use an open house sign pointing to the property, but if you use an open house sign, you have to use a rider that says by appointment only on it. CIR Legal and I would prefer that you not use the open house signs at all. But if you use an open house sign and you have a rider that says by appointment only, you are probably protected from any kind of a grievance at the board because you are saying it's by appointment only. But I would say for the foreseeable future, you should take the words open house out of your vocabulary. As far as distributing flyers to a property, you obviously can deliver them by mail or by social media. You are not supposed to deliver them in person. You're not supposed to be dropping anything off at the properties. Door knocking, you are not supposed to be door knocking now. Remember, you're an essential service, but door knocking for listings or whatever, that's not an essential service. The essential service is selling property, not taking listings. So it's not considered an essential service that you knock on people's door to try to get a listing on the property. So no door knocking, no leaving flyers at the house, no open houses. With that, any questions? And I have one more topic.
So is it possible for an agent to set up a table outside a property that they want to show and electronically sign people in prior?
It is technically possible. I think it's a bad idea. I know agents are doing it, but to me, setting up a table in front of the property is encouraging people to line up in front of the property, and you're going to wind up potentially on a busy property with 20 people in front of the property, not socially distancing, maybe not wearing masks. I think it's a terrible idea. I can't tell you it's illegal, but it's just the kind of thing that if the state sees people doing that, they will come back and they will outlaw showings altogether. So my opinion is that it should not be done, but I'm not sure that you can argue that it's illegal, because if you're having people sign up electronically by appointment, then technically you're doing it, but I think you're encouraging people to gather outside the property, which is not a good thing.
Well, you have to clean, and disinfect.
You have to clean in between each showing, right?
So
you got to follow all the protocols. So technically you could do it as long as everybody shows some distance and you didn't have a bunch of people gathered around. That's the biggest problem.
Maybe one suggestion is for everyone to use gloves entering the property. So
I just think that the other thing is, keep in mind that if a member of the public, like let's say a neighbor sees you setting up a table in front of the house and there's 20 people there, they're going to complain about it. And they're going to call your office and they're going to complain to you, Michael. And you're the one that's going to have to say why that's okay. And the problem is in my opinion, it's really not okay. It really shouldn't be done. And then if it gets pushed up to the state level and somebody figures out what agents are doing, the next thing you'll have is you won't be allowed showings at all. So, you know, you need to consider that as a factor. So the last thing I wanted to cover
Hey,
was—
Jeff, can I ask you a two-part question? As far as dropping off flyers and stuff at properties, I know we can't officially door knock.
Yeah.
But the dropping off, like on the front stoop and walking away, the fact that you're saying that's prohibited, is that new or has that always been the case?
It's you know, as usual, the law is not completely black and white, but the law says that you cannot drop off any paper materials at the property you're showing, you know, at the property you have listed. And CAR Legal has taken the position that if you can't drop things off at the property that's listed, why would you be able to drop things off at properties that aren't listed? So it's not 100% set in stone anywhere that that's the law, but that's CAR's interpretation of the law, that you shouldn't be doing that.
Okay. And then the second part, thank you for that. Remind me, the CVA form that you were talking about before,
Yeah.
Can you just remind me what that is in terms
Oh,
of?
the CVA form, the coronavirus addendum, is the form that you would use up front with an offer potentially that has, in paragraph 4, it has 2 check boxes saying that if the buyer or seller has an unforeseen circumstance as a result of the coronavirus, that the contingency periods could be extended by 30 days or the escrow could be extended by 30 days, as long as you check the boxes in paragraph 4. So that's the form that would allow a buyer or a seller the right to either extend contingencies or extend the close due to the coronavirus. And then they would fill out an NUCC form, which is the notice of unforeseen circumstance. And they would submit it to the other party and say, I can't close because I lost my job, I have coronavirus, whatever. And then that, depending on how the CVA form was filled out, it would automatically allow for potentially an extension of various contingencies that you've checked in the CVA or the close of escrow.
It doesn't have
what is your take either way in representing the buyer versus the seller? Should we fill that? Should we advise our clients to check that?
It's not something that you should advise the client to use or not use. It's simply something when you're working with a buyer that you should advise them of the existence of the form, let them read it and make a decision whether they want to use it or not. But keep in mind that that form can be used not only by a buyer, but by a seller. So technically, if you have that form signed, a seller might be able to delay the closing when a buyer doesn't want to for whatever reason. They got coronavirus or something happened, you know. So it's not a form that you're giving advice on because you'd be giving legal advice.
Right.
It's simply a form that you should be discussing with both the buyer and the seller at the time of the offer, and then they have to decide whether they want to use it or not.
I have a question to ask if I can. I wanted to know if you become a dual agent and you have the listing and or in the one single party agreement, when you are in the escrow, do you have this right to get the info of the tenants? For example, 11 units, 6 units, do you have the rights to get all the info about them that you can call them with the single party agreement and send them the PID?
I didn't really understand that.
So basically, if she's a dual agent and there's it doesn't have a listing, but just has a single party with the seller, can she reach out individually to the tenants there to try to get permission to, get access to the property for inspections?
Well, you don't do anything without the permission of the seller. So if you have if you have a listing or a single party compensation agreement, you need to get approval of the seller to reach out to the tenants to get approval of the tenants to show the property. The less contact you have with the tenant, the better off you are. The landlord should be doing that. But if you have the permission of the landlord to contact the tenant just for purposes of trying to arrange for showing, that's okay. But that's about as far as you should go with the tenant.
But the landlord cannot send them the PID. I believe an agent should send them.
Yeah, you can send, of course, you would send the PID form to the tenant to get the tenant to sign it to allow a showing. Yeah, that's your job as a listing agent to send the PID out to the tenant. But as far as getting approval of the tenant to show the property, that's something that either the landlord would do or the landlord would give you permission to contact the tenant to get permission to do that.
But however, I have the right to get the info of the tenants that I can send them the PID.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, you'd have to get the info from the landlord about the tenant in order to be able to contact them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
And Jeff, pieces of paper can't be at a house, but can they be in a box outside the house, flyers?
Yeah, that's a good question. Can you have a box with flyers in there?
They've said no on the card.
They did say no, because again, that's paper stuff at the house, and it's probably best not to do that. I mean, to me, that seems a little silly because when you put paper in a box, I'm not a scientist or a doctor, but I don't think the coronavirus sits on the paper for like 3 days or whatever. But that their CAR's position was just don't do it. I just think it's a good idea.
And just another question.
Doing everything by social media.
If you didn't have that CVA form and a buyer, after all the contingencies were removed, suddenly said, I lost my job because of the virus, is there legal cause or is it a gray area?
It's a gray area. So if you don't have the CVA form and the buyer loses their job and they can't close and they've removed all contingencies, then the seller's going to argue that, sorry, you moved all contingencies and I don't care if you can't close, you're going to forfeit your deposit. And the buyer's going to claim it's a force majeure and it was beyond their control. And because of the coronavirus, they can't close. So they're both going to go to attorneys, and you're going to find an attorney that will argue either side of that. And unfortunately, I'm not aware of any court cases yet because it's relatively new that actually deal specifically with whether the COVID-19 would be considered a force majeure, meaning, an act of God that would prevent you from doing something. My guess would be that that might be a good argument, but I think that it's going to be on an individual basis, and it's going to have to be a situation where the buyer was unable to perform, not that they didn't want to perform or they got scared or they're afraid of the market. So if you have a buyer who said, I think I'm going to lose my job, or I'm worried about the market, that's not going to work. But if you have a buyer who legitimately lost their job and no longer has an income, that's something that's going to have to, if the seller won't agree on returning the deposit, that's something they're going to have to get an attorney to make the argument. And you will find an attorney who will write a letter, that nice letter that says that it's a force majeure and that they should get their deposit back. But the seller will find an attorney that will say the opposite, and it'll probably go to mediation.
Yeah, we had one recently where a particular company, real estate company, claimed that. And in the end, they gave us $10,000 to walk away and claimed there was no harm. But then I found out independently on other deals, they were claiming the same stuff. And the other agent could prove that it's not true. They just keep claiming that, trying to use that as an in or out, as a listing side or buyer side.
Yeah, and if you're going to be successful as a buyer on a claim like that, you're going to have to show proof that it actually happened, not that, So if you got a lender sitting there saying they'll make the loan, and you're saying you can't qualify, there's a good faith element to that, and it's going to be on an individualized basis, but you're going to have to really, if you're going to be successful as a buyer to get your deposit back, if you have even a chance at that, you're going to have to absolutely prove that you couldn't perform because of the coronavirus.
Yeah, we quickly called the lender and had the lender say, yes, I can move forward. And then they called the lender and told the lender to say not. But we said, hey, look, we already had talked to the lender and said, you're fine.
Yeah.
So it was about speed a lot on this one.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to cover is the things that are going on with NAR. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's two different things. The first thing is that the NAR board of directors, and I'm not an NAR board of directors, so don't blame me. The NAR board of directors passed a new standard of practice. It's standard of practice 10.5 regarding hate speech. And it basically says that a realtor could be held responsible and could have a grievance filed against them for any hate speech they make, whether it is directly related to their business or whether they do it on their own personal Facebook account. So there was a tremendous amount of discussion about this at NAR, from what I understand. But at the end of the day, this new standard of practice 10.5 says that if you are involved in hate speech, whether it be in your business or on your personal Facebook or social media, if you get caught doing that, you can be taken to the board and punished accordingly as a grievance. So that's, not to mention the fact that if you do stuff like that, they're going to call your manager and complain and say, how could you have an agent working for you that says these kind of things? And you just have to be smarter than posting things like that against groups or any kind of a hate speech. So you need to be careful on that. That there will be a Q&A, if there isn't already, on that explains it a little more thoroughly. The second thing, which is a little more complicated, is that the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against NAR with regard to the commission payable to a buyer's agent. And they filed a lawsuit and they entered into a settlement agreement on the same day, which is kind of standard procedure when you're, when you have these entities negotiating a settlement with the Department of Justice. It still needs to be approved, but apparently it will be approved, and it'll probably go into effect towards the middle of January. And what it says is that you are going to have to disclose to your buyers the commission that is payable to you. So right now in the MLS, of course, you can go into the MLS and you can see what the commission is that's payable to you, right? You can see that it's 2.5%, 3%, or whatever, but the buyer doesn't see that because the buyer doesn't have access to the MLS. Well, the new rule from NAR, which is going into effect in the middle of January, is that the buyer is now going to be entitled to get that information. The simple solution to that problem is probably that the commission due to the buyer's agent will now be put in the public section of the MLS as opposed to the agent section, so that the public will be able to see that. Also, going along with that is that you will no longer be able to tell a buyer that you might as well work with me because it's free, it doesn't cost you anything. Because the fact of the matter is that the buyer is still paying a commission because it's built into the deal. So the seller's paying the commission, but in effect, the commission is built into the deal. And so you won't be able to go around to buyers and say, work with me, it's free, work with me, you don't pay me anything, because in fact, the commission is paid by the listing agent, and that takes into account the fact that, the buyer would be paying as well. The third element to this settlement agreement, which is pretty strange, is that any licensee who is affiliated with a broker, even if he's not a realtor, he's not a member of your board or CAR, he's just a licensee, you will have to allow lockbox access to that person. Right now, you only have to provide lockbox access to someone who's a member of, Greater LA. This isn't really your problem. It's really a MLS association problem, because you as a listing agent, you're just going to put a lockbox in the property, and whoever has a lockbox key or the code, they can get in. So the MLSs and the associations are going to have to figure out what to do about being able to provide the lockbox code or lockbox key to a non-member, and that's going to go through some interesting discussions about, well, if somebody has a lockbox key and not a realtor, they're not bound by the code of ethics. So how are we going to work on that? So that's all going to play out, and it's nothing you need to worry about right now, and it's nothing you really need to do. But the local association and the board are going to have to do something about that. Also, you will not be able to filter listings by buyer office commission. So in the past, you could put in there, don't only show me listings with commissions of 2.5% or above. And NAR's Department of Justice said that was not acceptable, so you will no longer be able to search. There won't be a search feature. And again, the MLS will take care of this. You won't be able to search by the commission to find out which commissions are below a certain amount or above a certain amount. Again, that's something the MLS is going to take care of, but I just want to make you aware of it. So the things you need to be aware of are that the buyer is going to be entitled to know what commission is being paid to you. I think the buyers knew that anyway. I don't think the buyers ever thought that you were working for free. So I don't know if that's a big deal, but that's just part of the negotiation between the Department of Justice and the NAR. And again, that goes into effect in the middle of January if it gets approved, and it looks like it will get approved. So
Jeff,
that,
the commissions used to be placed on the purchase contracts 2 or 3 generations back.
Yeah, a long time ago.
And it did cause problems, because quite often that buyer would start negotiating with you because they look at that number and then they multiply it out and say, you're getting all this. I want 5,000. I want 10,000 from you.
Yeah, there was a discussion. Yeah, I agree with you. There was a discussion I'm on standard forms of CAR, and there was a discussion just recently about whether to put it back in the MLS. Put it back in the purchase agreement, and everybody uniformly said no. So it will not go back into the purchase agreement, but it will be something that a buyer would be able to see at some point. So you do run some risk that they'll see what your commission is and try to negotiate with you. But again, you're not required to negotiate your commission. Okay, I've reached the end of what I wanted to talk about. Are there any more questions?
So I just want to, in January, there's going to be a competitor to Zip Forms, Glide.
Oh yeah, Glide. Yeah, you want me to mention that real briefly?
Yeah.
Or do you want to do it?
No, you could do it.
So you should all be familiar with the gardeners are outside. So is that bothering it? Can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the gardeners are outside, and within minutes, my dogs will be barking. So that may bring an end to this discussion. But the competitor is going to be Glide. Glide is going to be a new platform that you will be able to. It's going to be a CAR member benefit, and you will still be able to access zip forms like you always have, or you'll be able to use Glide. They're going to be similar products. They just will both be available to you to use. But the advantage to Glide is, if any of you have used it, is the disclosure package they have. So with Glide, you've got that great disclosure package where you can send it out to your sellers, and it shows the sellers how to fill out the TDS and the SBQ. It shows you how to fill out the Avid form, and you can use that separately from whichever platform you use. But the Glide product, Zip Forms was sold by CAR to another company, to Lone Wolf. So they no longer own Zip Forms. And so they're going to have two competing platforms. You can use either one. And there's some question about, if you have Zip Forms, whether it'll integrate with Glide. And so there's a whole production number going on there, which will be clarified within the next month or so. But you will have competing platforms that you can use. But again, the big advantage to Glide is the ability to use those disclosure packages.
Cool.
Okay, anything else? Everybody happy?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for doing this. And, maybe next, sometime in the second quarter,
Sure.
To do it.
I'm always around, so we could do another one. It's December now, so we could do another one maybe in, March or April or whatever.
And just remember, if you have a legal question, submit it on the intake form to me, and it'll get forwarded to Jeff, and he'll answer it. If you're in a bind, send me an email, and I'll just forward that email to Jeff. But the point is, I have to be notified of any communication or problems ahead of time.
Okay.
So, thanks,
Everybody
Michael and
good?
Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you,
Jeff.
guys.
Thank you, Michael.
You have a good day now.
Thanks,
All right.
Michael.
Thank you.
Talk to you all later.